Welcome to the Channel Islands Restoration Environmental Experts webinar series. We'll be getting started here in just a few minutes. If you haven't seen our past webinars, you can find them on our website. Just go to the education section at Channel Islands Restoration website and click on webinars, and every webinar that we've done in the last several years is on there. And this one will be on there as well in a couple of days. People are filtering in. I'll go ahead and tell you a little bit about Channel Islands Restoration. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We do habitat restoration, contracting, environmental consulting, and environmental education. I, by the way, am Ken Owen, Executive Director and co-founder of CIR. Tonight, we're talking about the what, the why, and how of kelp forest restoration. We're turning a little bit away from the terrestrial for once and getting a little bit into the marine, which is of great interest to me, so I'm looking forward to it. We'll be hearing from Tristin Anoush McHugh from the Nature Conservancy and Pike Spector from the Ocean Protection Council. I think I have two slides that say that again, just for emphasis. If you have some questions tonight, and we sincerely hope you do, please enter them into the Q&A section of the Zoom window. That way we can ask them at the end of the webinar. And so just type them in there, and we will make a list of them and ask the questions of our presenters. I also want to acknowledge that the land that we do our restoration work on is the unceded territory of the Chumash people. We pay our respects to Chumash elders, present and future, where they hold the memories, traditions, and culture of this land that we work to protect. So with that, I'll stop sharing one presentation and start another. Oops, wrong. Try that again. Okay. And I think we're starting with Pike. Is that correct?
Yeah, thanks very much, Ken, and good afternoon, everybody. My name is Pike Spector. I'm really excited to be here. Thanks to Channel Islands Restoration for inviting us to talk to you guys about the what, why, and how of kelp forest restoration. Next slide, please. So again, my name is Pike Spector. I'm the Biodiversity Program Manager for the California Ocean Protection Council. We're a cabinet-level policy body within the California Natural Resources Agency, and our job is to help protect, restore, understand, study, and manage, help facilitate the management of the coast and ocean in California. I'll be the first to say it, I'm a certified phycophile, phycology being the study of algae. I've been diving across temperate cold water ecosystems, studying kelp forests for the last 15 years. I first, I cut my teeth doing that research and then transitioned into the policy space, working for Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary as a California Sea Grant State Fellow, turned into a researcher and a research contractor, worked as a marine scientist up at Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary. But I came back to California to help restore, protect, understand, and enhance kelp forest ecosystems, and I'll turn it over to Tristin.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tristin Anoush McHugh. I'm the Kelp Project Director with the Nature Conservancy, and I live and work in Mendocino, Northern California. And I pay my respects to the Northern Pomo as traditional custodians of the land, to where the work I will share with you takes place, and also where I live. And I pay my respects to elders both past and present. I would also like to just say hello. I love kelp, love seaweed, love all of it. I'm a kelp forest ecologist and restoration or recovery scientist. I predominantly work to evaluate the tools and techniques. I get underwater. I work with a brilliant team of folks to just understand how we can mitigate any other kelp loss, which I'll share some of our work with you today. In addition to the on the ground local work, I also serve in state, regional, and global initiatives to move the needle not only here locally but also globally. One is through the Kelp Restoration Management Plan as a community working group member that Pike will share out. Another is through the coordinator for the Eastern Pacific Kelp Congress, or EPAC, to which I lead that initiative with 200 other folks along the Eastern Pacific. And then the last is through the Kelp Forest Alliance, which is a global initiative that launched the Kelp Forest Challenge that aims to protect and restore 4 million hectares of forests by the year 2040. So the work I'll share with you builds up into this larger global initiative, and on that initiative, I serve as the community advisor. So thank you so much for having me today. I'm so excited to share some of this work with you all. Thanks for being here. Pike, it's you. Next slide, please.
Alrighty. Great. Awesome. Thanks. So you guys are here to learn all about kelp and kelp forests and what we're doing to protect and restore. So I figured we'd do a little deep dive into kelp anatomy, certainly more than you wanted to know. Kelps are these really incredible organisms. We think of them as these brown algae. They make these massive forests. And so to understand that, I just wanted to orient you guys to what kelps actually are. They're not plants, but like plants, they photosynthesize. They're in their own kingdom, their own phylum, separate from our plants. And so they're really unique organisms. Starting in the bottom, they have these holdfasts, these root-like systems, but instead of acting like roots, like on a land plant, they grab the bottom. So kelps are only found on rocky reefs that have to have that hard substrate, and they use this holdfast to grab onto the bottom so they can grow into these giants. Like plants on land, they have a stipe that supports these blades where the actual magic of the photosynthesis happens, and many of the kelps, especially our canopy-forming species, have what's called a nematocyst, which is an air bladder that helps keep them buoyant and aloft so that they can form these really beautiful canopies. They also have what are called sporophyll blades. So like on this giant kelp here in this image, the sporophyll blades are on the bottom, but sometimes they can be found on the top. It's just different reproductive strategies. So next slide, please. So take out your pen and paper. There's going to be a quiz on this diagram at the end of the talk. I'm just kidding. I just wanted to highlight the fact that kelps are really bizarre. They're really unique. They have what's called this alternation of generations. For you to be able to see a large, healthy, vibrant kelp, like the one pictured in the pictures behind and on this diagram here, they start out as these microscopic organisms, these gametophytes that are either male or female. And these microscopic little teeny tiny organisms live on that rocky reef, and they produce gametes that, just like in an animal, undergo fertilization. That zygote then goes through mitosis and eventually turns into this massive sporophyte, this massive individual. And that's really the kelp that we interact with. Like this bull kelp pictured on the diagram, they can grow to be many tens of meters tall, which then eventually produce spores themselves, and those spores drop, settle to the bottom, and the process starts all over again. So next slide, please. Now that we know what a kelp is, how do we make a kelp forest? So in the traditional sense of kelp forests, the one that Tristin and I are going to be talking about, we have these massive canopy-forming kelps. Again, those large brown macroalgae. Next slide. And they grow all the way to the surface, but underneath, on the understory, on the benthos, down there on the rocky reef, we have the shrubbery, home to lots of other algae, these really diverse invertebrates, fishes, all sorts of cryptic critters, this really wonderful and diverse ecosystem. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we have the water column and the canopy. So like I said, those kelps grow on the bottom. They start on the bottom and they go all the way to the surface. And so you have that benthos understory down below, but in that space in between, through the water column and into the canopy, that's where you're going to see a whole host of diverse fishes, birds, and other visitors to the kelp forest, like sharks and sometimes even whales. Next slide, please. I'll hand it over to Tristin to talk about where we find kelps.
Pike is right about whales. I have, in fact, heard the clicking of an orca, and it was both beautiful and also horrifying at the same time. Okay, so taking us back out into kelp forests and their global distribution. So anywhere where kelp is cool, or sorry, where water is cool, you can find kelp typically. So if you look at this map here, this is just showing the global distributions of a few different species. Some form canopies like Macrocystis and Nereocystis like Pike mentioned, or Eularia, and then others are sub-canopy species that you can't see from the surface. But this map is just to show we typically draw a lot of attention to coral reefs. Some, folks who live right directly next to a kelp forest oftentimes know more about coral reefs than they do about kelp forests just because of their visibility. So just know that they cover a third of the Earth's coastline and support, millions and millions of people all over the place. And we actually came out with this kelp restoration guidebook that is linked here if you'd like to read more about the other case studies and places where folks are experiencing kelp challenges with kelp forests. Next slide, please. And kelp forests and people, right? They are so linked together. We depend on them for food, habitat, shelter. They serve for nutrient and carbon cycling. As Pike mentioned, they're a home for ecologically and economically important species. And they're just invaluable ecosystems beyond their aesthetic appeal. They're mostly found, they need light to photosynthesize, and that's typically where they occupy, is close to shore. And then there are some deep reefs as well, but they serve in these, like the number of services that they have for like coastal buffering, again, carbon transport, all these different services go beyond just the fact that they also, again, house this immense abundance of biodiversity. And so that in turn serves humans. Again, most of our population of Earth is hugging these coastlines, and it's a reason, especially in these temperate areas where the water is cool. Kelp forests give us life. So next slide, please. Great. And unfortunately, as with most ecosystems on the planet right now, they're experiencing these threats. And some are ubiquitous, right? But they kind of come down to these key themes that vary in the type of species or the intensity by locale. But they typically tend to hinge on the fact that the ecosystem gets in some form of imbalance. This imbalance might be generated predominantly by these changing ocean conditions with marine heat waves, increased storm frequency and intensity. Heat basically cooks kelp, right? It just like cooks them, and they're unable to really photosynthesize and do their other functions. So that heat also creates these negative feedback loops with grazers. When they don't have food, they go out looking for food, overabundance of sea urchins. So again, this imbalance typically leads to kelp forest loss. Do you mind going back one slide, please? Oh. Thank you. Sorry, next slide. Thank you. And just want to plug this product. I'll dump some things in the chat here, but we came out with the State of the World's Kelp Forest Report, and it's a global look at how kelps are faring globally. This was released at COP16 this past year, and again, it talks not only about what's happening in California, but how this centers on the state of change and some areas of recovery and stability that are happening, again, globally. So I'll drop a link for that, but please check that out if you'd like to learn more about, again, the bigger picture. Next slide, please.
All right.
Pike, it's you.
Thanks, Tristin. Alrighty, so now that we know where we can find kelps, as Tristin said, on rocky reefs and temperate ecosystems all around the world, let's home in on California and take a deeper dive into California's iconic kelp forests. Probably the best studied kelp in the world is Macrocystis pyrifera, the giant kelp, as seen in the top left here. And I just love that scientific name. Macrocystis means large bladder, and pyrifera is a nod to fire. But in the north of California, we see the bull kelp, Nereocystis lutkiana, which roughly translates to the mermaid's bladder, which I also think is just a really fun scientific name. But as Tristin said, these redwoods of the sea have an incredible wealth of biodiversity. They're home to economically and culturally important species, and they hold a deep cultural significance to California Native American tribes. Next slide, please. And as we said, this is a dynamic coastline. California has some of the most rich biodiversity in the marine and the coast and ocean space. Giant kelp dominates from about central Baja California all the way up to Point Conception at the boundary between central and southern California, and then it coexists with bull kelp across the central California coast to a little bit north of the San Francisco Bay. That's where bull kelp takes over, and it's the dominant canopy forming species all the way into the Gulf of Alaska. So Macrocystis, the giant kelp, has that sort of cosmopolitan global range, but bull kelp, there's a lot of bull kelp out in the water, or at least we'd like there to be. Next slide, please. So there's a reason that you guys are here today, and that's to learn about the challenges around kelp restoration. And so it's a little bit of a heartbreaking story, but in 2014, we saw the onset of a marine heat wave that devastated kelps across the northeastern Pacific. I want to orient you to this figure. I promise there won't be a lot of figures in this slide, but this one is probably the most important one that we could talk about today. On that x-axis, you'll see time starting in 1984, going to about 2023. And on the y-axis on the left, you'll see annual max canopy area. And that's the metric that we use. These data are from satellite imagery. And that maximum canopy area gives us an idea of the breadth and extent of kelp forests along our coast. And you can see that right in about 2014, across the coast, kelp forests were in trouble. So this unprecedented marine heat wave we call the blob settled on our coast. As Tristin said, it disrupts kelp's ability to photosynthesize, reproduce, and really withstand any challenges. And this event was coupled with the loss of sea stars, which are an incredibly important rocky reef predator. And all of this resulted in an explosion of native, mostly purple sea urchin populations that have been overgrazing the kelp forests and really hindering their recovery. And we coupled all of this with changing ocean conditions. So it's a pretty intense story. Kelps are resilient, dynamic ecosystems, but they've been in trouble for some time now. Next slide, please. So catalyzed by the near total kelp canopy collapse on the North Coast, California has taken bold action to conserve, restore, and protect biodiversity, bolster climate resilience, and maintain ecosystem services. In 2021, the state released the Kelp Action Plan, containing strategies and opportunities to address the kelp crisis. So far, the Ocean Protection Council has invested more than $10 million to implement the action plan, including monitoring kelp forest health, improving our understanding of the kelp loss and recovery, and testing restoration approaches. So we're going to deep dive a little bit more into the policy and then get into those restoration approaches. Next slide, please. To continue moving the needle forward, the state released an enhanced status report for giant and bull kelp and issued a precautionary closure for bull kelp harvest on the North Coast to help aid in natural recovery. And in 2023, California took a major step forward by launching the development of a statewide, ecosystem-based, adaptive kelp restoration and management plan. The Department of Fish and Wildlife, in partnership with the Ocean Protection Council, is working to ensure that this statewide plan, which builds on the Kelp Action Plan, is informed by the best available science, community input, and tribal perspectives. Next slide, please. This novel ecosystem-based plan for kelp forests is for the kelp forest supported by giant and bull kelp will provide a science-based framework for managing, protecting, and restoring kelp forests in the face of changing ocean conditions. And we call this the KRMP. Next slide, please. So this plan, the KRMP, will build out a comprehensive management framework for kelp forests across the state, incorporating restoration as a critical component in a suite of management options to ensure that these marine communities are sustainably managed into the future. This can be thought of, or the KRMP can be thought of as a fisheries management plan plus, in that it will go beyond essential elements of a fisheries management plan as defined by the Marine Life Management Act, and will include adaptive kelp harvest framework, a restoration toolkit, and an overarching ecosystem-based management approach. The latter two components are entirely novel. To date, no state fishery management plan has attempted to incorporate these elements, but such bold and innovative management strategies are essential for meeting the urgency of the climate crisis. Next slide, please. So since 2023, we've initiated this multi-pronged approach to developing the KRMP. This consists of a community working group, of which Tristin is a member, a science advisory committee, and a tribal engagement strategy that is integrated through a variety of channels in order to ensure that the development of the KRMP is grounded in the best available science and is responsive to the needs of the state, including California Native American tribes. Active partnerships and collaborations are underway with key state and federal agencies to ensure that the KRMP facilitates streamlined and effective management, including restoration upon implementation. Next slide, please. But of course, we're not waiting for the KRMP to be developed before we can start testing restoration approaches. And we could not achieve our vision for a healthy, vibrant, and resilient kelp forests without ground-truthing experimental restoration approaches. On the figure on the left there, you'll see some active or recently active projects statewide that are testing some of these novel recovery techniques. And I'm going to hand it back to Tristin to dive further into a case study. So next slide.
Great,
please.
thanks. Great, thanks, Pike. Okay, so just as a case, again, the need and desire to do restoration it's a flavor, right? You have to kind of understand what the ecosystem needs to kind of prescribe a treatment, right? So what I'll share with you today is like one such example. In short, multiple stressor events have severely destabilized the north coast of California. In the mid-1800s, otters were extirpated and have yet to return. Then beginning in 2013, a combination of warm water events paired with the loss of an apex predator contributed to the native purple urchin populations exploding to nearly 100 times their prior levels. This radically increased the grazing pressure on kelp. And so this imbalance contributed to the loss of more than 96% of kelp forests along the north coast in less than a decade, with no natural recovery observed to date. So 4% remaining. Next slide, please. And so to mitigate any further kelp loss, our recovery approach really has two parts. Part one is to suppress grazers in targeted areas to make space on the seafloor. Note this is human mimicry, while our team is actively working to reestablish Pycnopodia or the sunflower star in the area, creating that balance. But in the meantime, human. Next slide, please. And so, yes, this is a better figure. So resetting the ecosystem, again, ocean predators is one direction. There's also amphibious predators, humans. And so with the loss of those two ocean predators, the concept is that we are trying to understand or evaluate what our potential role is in that mitigation. Again, not to replace that predator, but until there's some ability to reestablish that balance. And perhaps they could work in conjunction with each other in the future. Next slide, please. And so there's grazer suppression, and part two is to enhance kelp. And this is to increase spore availability, create habitat, and load the system with vegetation to accelerate recovery. Next slide, please. Because ultimately the idea here is that if part one and part two happen in synchrony, especially in an annual system, bull kelp is an annual in the North Coast, right? Urchin remaining will become satiated and transition their feeding behavior. So while they're hungry, they're actively going out, just being destructive grazers, looking for food, consuming live kelp. In a normal state, when they are happy and healthy and get what they need, again, they're native urchin, they should be there. They hang out in cracks and crevices and wait for drift. So the idea is if we reduce the densities down, what is left will go and hide in the cracks and crevices, and that vegetation they will feed off of passively in a normal grazing state. And this will, in fact, lead to a transition in feeding behavior that allows emergent kelp to reestablish. Next slide, please. And so today I'll kind of walk us through two of these three objectives here. One is to implement a strategic sequence of techniques. The second is to explore two kelp enhancement approaches that we've been working on. And then lastly, I just want to flag, we know from the global community of practice that you have to have community participation, not just participation, but intentional stewardship and ownership of place for a project and movement to be successful. So we do take a lot of energy and time to really breed in the community here in a lot of different ways. So next slide, please. Objective one, next slide, please. So two of the four experimental sites that I'll share on today, both became deforested at different times, and subsequently restoration began. So the first site was deforested during the Great Losses, 2015. The other, Big River, was recently in 2023. So restoration started at two different times, and they have two different scales. The work I'll share out is a state-funded program as well. So this work, again, kind of builds into our evaluation of these tools and techniques that Pike was mentioning for the KRMP. I also want to flag with the note below, if you see those that wave model there, this is an open coast system. It's incredibly challenging to work in. It's incredibly cold. The system regularly clocks 9-meter waves. So we're getting that, mostly in the winter, but year round we get really big swell and the water is quite cold. Next slide, please. So our approach is really, again, acknowledging that it's an open coast system. It's cold, it's challenging, and we need to, prescribe something that works. So first, we identify where to do restoration. So where can we protect and expand remnant kelp, that 4%? The second is to suppress native purple urchin grazers, then catalyze vegetative recovery in two ways. One, by outplanting plants, right, like kelps themselves. And the second is through drift supplements, again, trying to load the system with vegetation so urchin change behavior into a passive state. Next slide, please. And at the core of our work, again, Big River, we saw this highly valuable kelp refugia withstand those great losses, but then recently experienced this 91% decrease in kelp canopy in just a year. This was part of the surviving 4% again. So starting in 2022, you see shades of green shrinking. And by 2023, all that is left is this dark green. This dark green was our starting point as we initiated kelp forest restoration in 2024. Next slide, please. And we use this grid to guide commercial urchin divers to strategically harvest urchin, mostly along the kelp edge, like you see in blocks 1, 2, 3, 12, 17, 22. So mostly along that edge to, again, expand the forest. Then in areas where kelp has been absent, the center of the site where you saw it, really disappear, the kelp, we are enhancing kelp. So that's where we are doing the kelp enhancement work to get vegetation back in that area to accelerate recovery. Next slide, please. And so some results in 2024, commercial urchin divers harvested 27 tons of purple urchin from 6 acres of restoration sites. And 6 vessels, 12 divers, contributed to over 500 underwater hours and provided a substantial opportunity to the sea urchin fishery. We also conducted urchin morphometrics to mobilize food and non-food uses for urchin harvested for this product. And there's some viable opportunities with urchin ranching and also through geoaggregates and even creating countertops. I'll drop a link to a recent article in the SF Chronicle about some of this work, but these urchin that we're harvesting are being used, and that's the intention. So just wanted to share big effort, and we're very actively looking for outcomes. Next slide, please. And in addition to those outcomes, we're also like what happened on the seafloor. We did see some natural spillover anticipated from protecting the existing kelp. So looking at these figures, we start in April, there were urchin. In May, we cleared them. In June, we start to see these small grasses starting to show up. July, we're starting to see our little shrubs, our little trees. And by August, the forest has grown. It was reproductive, had fish in it, and was dropping spores all over the site. So very exciting. Next slide, please. And it doesn't look like much, but this is, 6 months after intervention, right? we're corroborating these underwater seeings, you know, above, from looking from above. Here in bright pink, you can see where kelp came back. We were able to protect and expand by 172% from the year prior along this legacy kelp line. So now I want to pivot over into where we're planting kelp at the center of the site where you see 9 and 10. Next slide, please. Next slide. Great, thank you. I think there's a video here, but we pivoted. There was some decision making on how we plant kelp here, but really we transitioned into this archive module, which is this lifted. It's really, you know, it's a meter or so off the benthos. It has a 45-pound base and line, has a metal strut, a little bit of PVC, and we, if you mind just starting the video, I think you can just hit next and it should go. Thank you. You can see where a technician is splicing kelp that we had produced in tumble culture in a lab facility with source population from the site, threading that into the module itself to give it that little lift off the seafloor and allow it to grow. Next slide, please. And if you just hit play, great, thank you. This was actually last week. We deployed 50 of these archives into the site, but we worked with a commercial sea urchin diver and his vessel to deploy these units. But essentially they're small footprint, cost saving, scalable, and open coast appropriate. So that lift keeps it away from urchin, and that growth from the unit itself to the surface happens relatively quickly. And so I'll walk you through some of our results from last year, knowing that these are in the water right now at a slightly larger scale and slight modifications. Next slide, and you can press play on this one as well. This is that archive module just after deployment. You can see, you know, the kelps are happy and healthy. And again, these have no permanent infrastructure. You deploy them in spring and you pull them in fall. Next slide, please. So I promise I don't have too many graphs, so I just want to share for those of you who want to see like how these things perform and what we're looking at here. So here you'll see 2 sites, Albion in the orangish and then Big River in the blue. They were deployed at different times because we want to know when the best deployment time was. So we have spring for Albion, summer for Big River. You can see for both of them, we had a first set of archives deployed, and we had some functional modifications we wanted to kind of tinker with. So we spliced more in for the second set that you can see. And from those, we had 40% survivorship, which is actually pretty good. And if you think about like going out and planting in your garden and you put out a ton of seeds, you may see 100% of those seeds grow, but you're going to want to thin them also to allow, you know, the garden to grow. So thinning was great for survivorship as well. And we found that spring was ideal outplanting. Next slide, please. Great. And here we see growth. So by splicing individuals, not using like a seeded line, we were able to kind of like seed starts or like a plant starter versus you know, versus going from seed. We were able to bypass a mortality bottleneck, and within 2 months, we were able to see stipes grow up to 3 meters. So pretty great growth. These things are incredible. Next slide, please. And what you're seeing here highlighted is also an extended reproductive season. So what that means is they became like looking at Albion, for example. The orange, you'll see they were sending out spores from June to October. They were pumping out spores, and we're talking a lot of spores. Next slide, please. And you can press play. Thank you. And what that means for spores is we averaged about 26 reproductive blades per individual with about 200 sori, those are the packets you're seeing here, released per individual per month. So our preliminary spore release studies in the lab estimate a total of 82 trillion spores that could have been released by just 6 of these archive modules. 82 trillion. So that's a huge amount of spores that were now put in the environment by a very few number of outplanted individuals, which is pretty important for a system like this. Thank you. And additionally, we also saw fish recruitment. So these are not only creating spores and vegetation, but they also are incredible habitat, especially for young of the year rockfish. Next slide, please. And you can press play. Here you'll see, we saw 10 plus species, talking about biodiversity, right? Like we saw 10 plus species of rockfish recruiting to these units, and they're like these oases in the middle of a desert, right? They're coming to them, they're using them, they're feeding. It's just beautiful to see. Next slide, please. And so lastly, I'll go through this quickly, but the drift. I know I talked about changing urchin behavior, but we also deployed drift to, again, protect these drift recruits. Next slide, please. So grazer assays. What we basically did is put out these units, that assay bars that were put out in addition to drift kelp. And so you can think of the kelp on the bars here as kelp recruits on the reef, and then the surrounding as drift. Next slide, please. And so we were just trying to see if we put a ton of drift, if you put a lot of vegetation, will that distract the urchin? And what we found was yes. We found that whether you're in a barren or a restoration site, there's actually less live kelp consumed on the assays when the drift is present. So what this means, again, these are preliminary results, but what we're seeing is that the drift is distracting the grazers from outplanted kelp, also no matter the density of urchin. So this is a huge I think win in thinking about what kind of tools or techniques could we implement to change urchin behavior and allow the forest to breathe. Next slide, please. Okay, so in summary, I would just briefly say we found both kelp enhancement tools. Again, urchin grazer suppression is very important for those kelp edges, but further away from those edges, we found that outplanting creates this instant habitat, that year spore dispersal, and drift helps mitigate consumption on recruits. So this is giving us hope that this coming year, the benthos will recover. So we're waiting for those seeds that dropped last year to start showing up. And excitingly, I actually was just on the phone with one of our commercial urchin divers and my team today, and they were telling me they're starting to see little kelps showing up in these areas furthest away from the edge. So hope for us. I'm feeling pretty optimistic about this year, but hope to report back soon. Next slide, please. And before moving on, I just very much want to highlight, I know I shared out this work, but this was an incredible collaboration with industry, artists, scientists, just the community, and very much acknowledging the community of practice. A lot of the tools that I implemented here today was inherited from Parks Canada and BC Haida Gwaii Nation and Puget Sound Restoration Fund and Oregon Kelp Alliance to the north of us. So just want to flag that global movement. Next slide, please.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tristin. We're so incredibly impressed and excited by the results from this project and deeply inspired by the community support and rallying that you've been able to do. So we wanted to end on a high note, again, with Tristin's super compelling results, as we're charting a course to resilience to protect, restore, and enhance kelp forest ecosystems across the state. And we're doing this by continuing our meaningful engagement with California Native American tribes, coastal communities, and restoration practitioners as we seek to address and fill knowledge gaps and plan for the future. And of course, California has promoted our learn by doing approach to kelp restoration and conservation because this is an emergent field. But the time is now, and it's never been more important. And of course, all of this is at the core of developing and implementing the kelp restoration and management plan. Next slide, please. And we couldn't do this without a collaborative, partnership-based approach. These are just a handful of some of the incredible entities, institutions, and partnerships we've built out over the years upon which this body of work rests. So next slide, please. I think that's it, and we'll be standing by to take any questions. Thanks for your time.
That was terrific. Thank you, guys. As a reminder, let me stop the share here. If you'd like to ask some questions, and we hope that you do, you can enter them into the Q&A section of the Zoom program. Looks like we have a few. John, do you want to take it away, please?
Yeah, so we have one from Deborah, and she's asking, I understand it's likely too early to determine the impact of the runoff of the fires in the LA Malibu area. However, is there any initial impact you're seeing on the health of the nearby kelp forest as well as the range of the impact? I'm not sure if you guys work in that area, but maybe you could try to answer that.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at that, and Tristan, feel free to fill any gaps. But OPC has
Please.
been involved in the monitoring efforts with our coastal partners down in the Southern California area. So it's definitely too early to tell what the impacts are. These systems take time to respond. I will say that preliminary results and a synthesis of other fire impacts show that unfortunately, fire debris, that ash, settles on reefs and can smother reefs pretty effectively. And so we're waiting to see, what the recent storm events, this current wind event going on, what the upwelling does, to see what the net positive ecosystem impact is. And I'd like to point out that the Santa Monica Bay, where the fire runoff is concentrated, is mostly sandy, but there are some really impressive rocky reefs that have some amazing kelp forests ringing the bay, generally closer to Point Doom and closer to Palos Verdes. And down in Palos Verdes is one of the longest running kelp restoration projects. That's run by an entity called the Bay Foundation, and so we're working very closely with them to monitor the impacts in the months and years to come. It's a great question.
We have a few questions from Julie. I'll start with the first one. What causes the loss of sea stars?
A disease. It was a disease. There's actually a paper coming out within the next month or so that for 10 years we weren't sure what the causative agent was, but we will know pretty soon to isolate the variant, which is a really important tool towards understanding how you can potentially address the disease or find ways to safeguard some sea stars. But it was a disease that we lost the sea stars to, which is pretty common. You get marine diseases, but this was the largest on record. It killed an estimated 5 billion stars in this event. Huge mortality event, incredible mortality event.
So unfortunate.
Yeah.
I actually watched that kind of come through. I live in Carpinteria, which is below Santa Barbara. I watched that kind of come through and wipe out all the sea stars that are on the coast here. Julie has another question. Tell us about... go for it.
Sorry, really quickly, just one other thing on the sea star, because you might, I don't want to end on a downer. The upper of that is there are now, there have been these captive breeding programs, one in Friday Harbor that the Nature Conservancy has been working in the space since conception to, really understand what we can do about sea star loss. There have been remnant populations that have survived these losses. So some of those individuals have been bred and put into captive breeding programs to propagate those individuals. And about a year ago, those first breeding programs hit ground here in California. So they have not been put back in the water yet, but just trying to close the life cycle of those individuals and get them to survive. There are now, I think, 4 captive breeding programs, including Cal Academy of Sciences, Aquarium of the Pacific, Sunflower Star Lab, others that we're working with to establish those hubs. So more on it soon, but great questions. Sorry, had to share.
Oh, no.
Great.
Julie also is asking about zombie urchins.
Ooh, yeah, that's a fun one.
Yeah.
So sea urchins are pretty interesting little critters, right? As Tristan showed in her talk, they like to hide out in cracks and crevices because they're effectively little armored, spiky balls. These little critters that don't want to get eaten, right? They're pretty tasty. I don't know how many of you out there like to eat uni, but they're pretty susceptible to predation, and so they don't like to be out and exposed. But Tristan showed all of those pictures of the sea urchin barrens. That's what happens when the urchins come out of those cracks and crevices and overgraze a reef. And for whatever reason, based on their physiology, they can go into this dormant sort of stasis where they can live off of next to nothing and go into this sort of shut down metabolic state, just waiting for those drift subsidies, as Tristan was mentioning, or, diatoms or other sort of microalgae that grow. And so it's a bizarrely self-propagating problem. You would think that organisms in such a high density that are starving would be susceptible to diseases like what Tristan was talking about, and yet our urchins seem to be pretty resilient, hence the zombie phrase. But Tristan, I don't know if you want to tack on to that.
No, I think that was reasonable, Pike. That was good.
And we have a question from one of our board members, Helene. I love your work and the presentation. Do you have a percentage increase on the 4%? Also, what percentage reduction was there for bull versus giant kelp?
Tristan, you want to take the first half of that one?
Sure. I mean, really briefly, I mean, it's around 4% of losses. We have not seen like substantial returns. So I'd say we're probably still ballparking around 4% of forest. What I will say is we had from, that small patch that we had at that one site, 172% increase from that small amount. So, small little bits kind of leveling up, but it's probably still ballpark quite low. Pike, would you like to take the second part?
Sure. Yeah, I think the second part of that question was about differences from giant kelp and bull kelp, right? I apologize. I forgot to. It was in my talking points. I forgot to include it when I was talking about the differences between those two kelps. There's a reason that giant kelp is dominant from Point Conception south. It has a much higher thermal tolerance, so it can handle marine heat waves or strong El Niños or summertime heat signatures a little bit better, actually quite a bit better than bull kelp can. And so the recovery on the central coast, where giant kelp is still found, down into the south coast has been patchy. Some reefs are still in recovery mode. Other reefs, like around the Channel Islands down here in Southern California, some of the Channel Islands have over 100% of their estimated kelp abundance, which means that they're doing really, really, really well. This just goes to show that these are really dynamic ecosystems that, we're still studying and still trying to understand. Giant kelp is also a perennial. I meant to say this before, so apologies. Individual giant kelps can live for up to 7 years. Bull kelp is an annual. So all that growth that Tristan showed is in a really short growing window. So we think that has a lot to do with the impeded recovery, where the system is just a little bit more out of whack. But we are working on it, and we look at the kelp canopy abundance in the fall quarter annually. That tends to be the peak annual abundance for both giant and bull kelp. And so we've just finished processing the data from Q3 2024, and things are looking better in Southern California, Central California. They look great on the Channel Islands, but the North Coast is still struggling.
Thank you. And Tristan, I know you have to leave shortly, so if you need to hop off, thank you for joining.
Yeah, thank you. I'll drop if there are any last minute questions, feel free. I'll drop my work. I think you may have seen it, but here we go. There is my email if you'd like to get in touch. Thank you all so much for having me. Great questions, and would love to follow up and keep you posted. I dropped a couple links in here. One is the State of the World Kelp Report, and the other one is the case. If you go to bullkelp.info, you'll learn more about our case study that I shared with you, and it also has an interim report that kind of builds out on more of this if you'd like to learn more or how to get involved.
Thank you so much.
Baby.
Yeah, thank you all again so much. Bye.
What did I do good?
Okay, so we have a few more questions to get through here. Actually, quite a lot. So we'll try to go through these quickly. One from Nina. Hi, I would like to ask if any of you also work with commercial kelp farm policy for California or other states. I know it's a challenge.
Yeah, that's a great question. So on that community working group for the kelp restoration and management plan, we have representation from kelp growers, though it's a tricky landscape here in California. The Ocean Protection Council is working on an aquaculture action plan. And I understand that there are barriers to entry for starting up new kelp aquaculture. There's just a sort of fundamental difference between growing kelps for consumption and for human use versus growing kelp for restoration. So as Tristan mentioned, the bull kelp that's being grown for the project up in Mendocino is actually from Moss Landing Marine Labs. They harvested kelps remnant populations from Mendocino, brought it down to Moss Landing, developed these really innovative and absolutely incredible aquaculture techniques to then use those kelps for outplanting. So that's the only pathway for those kelps is to be outplanted back into the environment, which is again different than that aquaculture approach, which is more for consumption or for feed for other aquaculture species. But it's very much top of mind, and it's definitely something we're working on.
Here's a question from Grace. Anything we can do to help your mission other than financial donations, of course?
Well, I work on behalf of the state of California, so your support as voting members of the public, as informed constituents, is honestly people who are excited about kelp and kelp forests does tremendous work for us. You know, we don't want to be working in a vacuum. Kelp forests are near and dear to my heart. And as I said, it's the reason I came back to California was to help advance the KRMP. So staying connected to the ocean, finding that spark that makes you feel connected to this ecosystem that are, native to California, and they're right outside of your back door. That helps us tremendously.
And that leads us to this next question from Bambi. How do we stop the overharvest of the local kelp? The harvesters come at night and leave massive piles of ripped up kelp on the beach. Do you know anything about that?
So we are addressing kelp harvest as part of the harvest framework for the kelp restoration and management plan for that KRMP. Right now in California, there's actually only one commercial kelp harvester, mechanical commercial kelp harvester. Sorry, specifically down here in Santa Barbara, there's one entity, one organization that harvests giant kelp from the surface, and there are very strict regulations for how they're allowed to do that. In Northern California and in Central California, things are a little bit different, but I would point you to the Department of Fish and Wildlife's website around kelp harvest, and I can get that URL in just a sec. But again, down in Southern California, there's only one mechanical harvester, and that's that boat that does take kelp, giant kelp blades, but they're only allowed to harvest down to the first meter of the surface. So they can't take out an entire individual. I didn't include this in my talking points, but it's a nice back pocket fact. Giant kelp is the fastest growing organism on the planet. It's under the water. They can grow up to 1 meter per day in the growing season. So we're not actually super concerned about giant kelp harvest. In California, bull kelp, because it's an annual and because the vegetative blades are only on the surface, there are different rules and regulations for how bull kelp can be harvested. And again, the Department of Fish and Wildlife issued that preliminary closure in Mendocino and Sonoma because of the loss. Right now, there's really only active harvest in the Monterey Bay area and in Del Norte County. But again, I have some projects that we're getting spun up right now that'll help assess the impacts of harvest for biomass and for recovery for both species. And so it's very much top of mind.
Thank you, Pike. Here's one from William. Well, while bull kelp seems to be very receptive to the ARC approach, has the approach been tested with giant kelp here on the Central Coast?
That's a great question, William. It has not. I just shared a link with John to share with you guys that'll take you to the California Sea Grant landing page for kelp research. Tristin's proposal to use these archives to grow bull kelp was absolutely novel. This is the first time anybody in the world has tried anything remotely like this, and we are very much considering the implications for this kind of kelp enhancement approach across the state. But kelp restoration, the science around kelp restoration, is a brand new field. The Bay Foundation, again, in Southern California, has been testing urchin culling, specifically just the removal of sea urchins, for well over a decade now. And that's the longest running project in California and one of the longest running in the world, really. So we're still working on it. That's why we're filling those knowledge gaps, testing all the tools in the toolkit.
So we have about 5 or 10 minutes. We'll see how many we can get through here. We have one from Kevin. How did MPAs help or hinder the ability to predator control in them? So like how is it helping predators? Or did they need to be avoided? Notice that there aren't any MPAs on the top of Big River and Albanian. To suppose that's a factor, how is that a potential barrier to increase restoration going forward?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll see if I can untangle that quickly. The MPA network, the Marine Protected Area Network in California, was designed to enhance, protect, and bolster biodiversity. It doesn't provide protection from things like marine heat waves, right? These are spatially managed areas. We can't just cool the ocean down when it gets too hot. So that's why we've seen losses inside of MPAs. That's above and beyond the sort of classic kelp forest trophic web, urchin dominant or urchin predation events. But we are seeing the impacts of the marine protected areas supporting fish populations like sheephead and lobster and other kelp forest organisms. And so, we think of these MPAs as these living laboratories, as these spaces, these sort of refugia for recovery. And as Tristin said, these kelps drop their spores. The bull kelp drop their spores from the surface and the currents take them away. The giant kelp drop them on the benthos and they get pushed along the reef. So we're seeing spillover from the MPAs, helping to support the recovery of these species and the ecosystems that they support.
Yeah, it's so important to have these protected areas. One more question from Kevin. We got tribal engagement needs to involve funding tribal marine programs locally to do the work similar to the commercial diver efforts highlighted in the presentation. Yeah, I agree. We agree.
Yeah, not so much a question as a statement,
Yeah,
but we wholeheartedly agree. I will say that California Native American tribes have been stewarding the coast and ocean since time immemorial, and I'm not in a position to tell them what to do. We are hearing from California Native American tribes. We are integrating their feedback, their concerns, their desires, their vision into the kelp restoration and management plan. And we are actively funding projects with California Native American tribes. Again, if you look at that Sea Grant webpage, you'll see a link to the Kelp Guardians program, which is up in far northern California. And it's really, it makes me so happy to see tribal youth getting trained to do scuba surveys, to be scientific divers, to take an active approach to monitoring and restoration. I don't get to scuba dive for work anymore, but I get to support other folks getting in the water, so it's almost as good.
That's awesome. And I think we do kind of, there's a question, but I think we kind of already have this in California because I know urchins are food in this area. People eat them. Have you considered building markets for urchins to create demand for companies to harvest them? I know that this approach has been applied to aquatic species elsewhere, for example, invasive crabs in the Mediterranean.
Yeah, so as you did note, John, the commercial urchin fishery in California is one of the most lucrative fisheries in our state, and that's marine and freshwater. I mean, it's a big deal, especially down here in the Santa Barbara Channel. The caveat, and this is why I put that qualifier in my slides, it's the purple urchin that's really overgrazing the system. And traditionally, purple urchins haven't been harvested as heavily as the native red sea urchin because they just don't get as big and there wasn't as much market demand. Again, as a representative of the state, it's not my place to create markets, but we're, of course, absolutely facilitating the commercial harvest of purple and red sea urchins to make sure that, the commercial urchin community is involved. And I will say that Tristin and others are thinking really creatively about ways to use the culled, removed purple urchins. There's traditional in-water culling where you're hammering, smashing, bashing them underwater. And we've had a lot of feedback, mostly from California Native American tribes that said, hey, that's really disrespectful. The urchins have every right to be there, and just smashing them in place is dishonors the urchin. But if we take them out, and we try techniques like urchin ranching, where we fatten them up on land and then can sell them at market, or use them as fertilizers, or as Tristin said, countertops. I even went to a dye making workshop from purple urchins up in Mendocino last year. We're thinking creatively, trying to close that loop.
That's awesome.
And I will just say, I don't love eating uni. I've cracked open far too many urchins for science, but you can add them into your pasta or into your soup and into other dishes like that, and they do taste pretty good. So we can get creative.
Okay, we have 3 more, so we can get through that. From Lindsay, the long-term data on kelp canopy cover across California shows significant fluctuations over the decades. Even before the recent major decline, what were some of the primary drivers behind these historical periods of low kelp abundance in specific regions?
That's a great question. The knee-jerk response here, the sort of low-hanging fruit, are El Ninos. And if you all are from California, if you've lived on the West Coast, you know what it's like when an El Nino comes in. We can have weak El Ninos, we can have strong El Ninos. These data that I show, that kelp canopy data, start in 1984, specifically because that's when the first Landsat imagery became available to us. And so that's our effective baseline here. There happened to have been a really strong El Nino in 1983. So we are sort of starting this view with what we think of as a potential kelp recovery. But if you think back to that figure, you probably don't have it in front of you, but it's burned into my brain. The 97, 98 El Nino, that was a doozy. That really disrupted kelps across the state. But some really interesting studies showed a delayed response in recovery. And so there's this sort of temporal lag where in Southern California, the giant kelps that are better able to respond to intense heat, they came back pretty quickly. Central California, those kelps, not as resilient to heat, much more resilient to big waves, which come with El Nino. They responded a little bit more slowly. We also are only just now getting a handle on what marine heat waves actually are. And so, it's possible that there have been marine heat waves that we just weren't able to detect before modern techniques. But really that, the blob, the 2014 to 2016 marine heat wave, that was the alarm bell. That was the loss of kelp in NorCal. That was the canary in the coal mine.
That's so unfortunate. So we have one more comment, one more question. John Campbell says, this has been an excellent session. I'm grateful for your dedication and smart approach. Thank you. One more question from Nina. For someone who has no scientific background but wants to start working with kelp, mostly kelp-based products aligned with restoration, do you have any tips about how to start?
That's an interesting question. I'm not really sure. I mean, you can harvest kelps and other seaweeds off the coast without a commercial fishing permit in the state of California, up to 10 pounds per day, except for a couple of species. So I would obviously urge you to look at the California Department of Fish and Wildlife's website. If you want to harvest urchins, you need a permit for that. You can get a recreational permit to harvest sea urchins, a fishing license, pretty easy to get one. But to help with restoration, I would point you towards groups like the NPA Collaborative Network, Reef Check California, though Reef Check California is part of the Reef Check Kelp Forest Monitoring Program, and getting involved with the local entities in your area, because we have kelps statewide. And we're really starting to see more of a community drive towards being engaged actively in restoration. So I think it's definitely an emergent field, and being informed and and keeping up with the cause is definitely helpful.
Okay, one more from Bambi. Do we have time for one more?
Sure.
Could the loss of giant kelp be a contributing factor to the excessive algae bloom and domoic acid? Does kelp utilize the nitrates and clean the water?
That's a complicated one. I'll try to answer that, and it's a great question. I'll try to answer that as quickly as I can. The short answer is no. I don't think that there's an interplay between a harmful algal bloom and the loss of giant kelp. But kelps do take up nitrates, and other algal species have been shown to remediate certain heavy metals and other other pollutants in the water column, though they're not quite like land plants. They don't sequester and hold carbon in their tissues for all that long. They're photosynthesizing and producing lots of sugars and sloughing that off into the environment and creating the base of these complicated food webs. The harmful algal blooms may be, influenced by humans and land use changes, but the ocean is an incredibly dynamic and complicated system. And so, it's not like harmful algal blooms are only caused by humans. There's a lot in the coast and ocean system that is outside of our control and outside of our understanding. But, this obviously is a really tragic event. We don't like to see the domoic acid build up. It's tragic, but, we're resilient in California, and we're doing our best to protect the coast and ocean.
Thank you, Pike. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a great, formative webinar.
Really appreciate it, Pike. And just as a reminder to everyone that you can watch this webinar and all the other ones that we've done on our website by going to channelislandsrestoration.org, the Channel Islands Restoration website. You can look in the education section and find the link to the webinars and see this one and all the other ones that we've done. We really appreciate your time, Pike, and thank you for all the participants. And sorry we couldn't get to everyone's questions, but we got to most of them, and we appreciate your effort of typing them in there so we could ask Pike and Tristin for their answers. So thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, with that, we'll say good evening. And when is our next webinar, John?
Our next webinar is with the Friends of the Condors, and that's on June 10th.
Okay, great. Looking forward to it. Good night, everyone.